Thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Susan Patrick from iNACOL, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar. It's Competency-Works, and the webinar topic is the learning edge, supporting student success in a competency-based learning environment. This is a real focus on how to provide student support in competency-based learning. We're delighted today to have Nicholas Donahue, President and CEO of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation, joining us today by phone and opening up the discussion. Laura Shabila, leader in youth and education issues and now a doctoral student in Harvard's Education Leadership Program, will be presenting. And I will help moderate the conversation today along with our co-leader and partner in CompetencyWorks, Chris Sturgis, principal of Medicinet. We also want to say to all of the attendees and participants, you're invited to participate in the discussions. We welcome to have you use the chat room, ask questions, share ideas, resources, and links. We are archiving the webinar today. So before we get started, I'm going to just go ahead and give a real quick background for those of you that are new to CompetencyWorks. CompetencyWorks is a project of iNACOL, the International Association for K-12 Online Learning. We're a nonprofit organization with over 4,000 members. We're focused on student-centered new learning models using online and blended learning that are competency-based. We're trying to help prepare students for success in their college careers and society in the 21st century. When you look at these issues, iNACOL's #1 policy priority is in moving away from seat time to competency education supporting policies and practices to provide more effective learning environments for students. iNACOL is pleased to partner on the CompetencyWorks project with so many terrific organizations. We really couldn't do this work without the help of the American Youth Policy Forum, National Governors Association, Jobs for the Future, and our terrific advisory board. We'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize the leadership and support of the Nellie Mae Education Foundation. And not just because Nick's on the call today. Nick has been an outstanding partner and leader. The Nellie Mae Education Foundation's leadership, creativity, and willingness to take risks to help improve and move the field has been exemplary. So I want to thank Nick and all of the team at Nellie Mae. Now a little bit about CompetencyWorks. I'm going to the third slide. The website has resources, blogs, links to the wiki. And we're dedicated in this website to create a new virtual learning space for those of you advancing competency education across the country. As you probably know, you can find the blog posts that are written by teachers, principals, students, consultants, experts, and state leaders sharing what they're learning. We're periodically writing briefing papers, issue papers on topics that are of high interest, including today's topic of student support. We offer the Competency-Based Pathways Wiki to find additional resources when you need them. And last, this webinar will be archived and the resources can be found at the Competency-Based Pathways Wiki. You may want to create a tab so that you can take a look during the webinar. You can find this link to the wiki on the top right part of the homepage of competencyworks.org. It's the blue button under resources on the right-hand side. During the webinar, we highly encourage you to use the chat room. We have found it's a vital part of our conversations. Please introduce yourself now, say where you are from and your interest in competency education. Feel free to ask questions, comments, refer people to resources, and talk about the work you're developing. Ask any questions where we might be able to help you. We have an incredibly knowledgeable group of innovators participating today. And with that, we are ready to begin. I will turn it over to our lead author and project manager, Chris Sturgis with Medicinet.
Thanks, Susan. This is Chris. So I just have to tell you all, I have this idea that we're all munchkins. Susan, your voice is getting really high periodically, so I'm now wondering what I sound like on the webinar, but we can just all pretend we're wearing munchkin clothes. So being very serious, The working definition of competency education is very, very important to our work because all of us are using very different language around the country. We have proficiency-based in Oregon, and I just heard from Freeport, Illinois, some folks who are joining us, that they're using personalized mastery. And so the definition is what we're holding ourselves to as we drive towards quality. It's a shared definition. We're always looking at how we can fine-tune it and better it. So please always share any ideas that you have around that. Now, if you are totally new to competency education, what we encourage you to do is go to the wiki and look for the detailed definition, because that will give you more information about each of these points. But what we're always looking at when we look at the definition and when we talk about competency education is how we're driving towards quality, and in that concept is how we're driving towards equity. We have to make sure that these elements all together are actually making a difference for our vulnerable kids. Now, folks sometimes try to take one of these at a time. It's really all 5 of these elements together that makes competency education. If you have any questions about what competency education is, please do just ask questions in the chat room. Susan or any of the other folks who have been working in the field for a long time, I'm sure will be happy to answer. Now, getting going on this topic, we are talking about the 4th element, which is making sure that we have timely differentiated supports. And if you think about the following 2 quotes, we really start to think about what the system has to look like. Too often, schools and districts start the transformational process and then find themselves with a large group of students that didn't complete the competencies in a course, didn't stay on pace, or even fell behind. This is, of course, no different than today's system. The difference is that in the traditional system, we don't expect students to move on to the next course without having fully gaining the knowledge and skills they need. Thus, what we are really designing for is to make sure that all kids have more time and differentiated supports. We all dream of the day when all students are on grade level. It would be great to have an improved factory model where everything is linear. The fact of the matter is we're always going to have students with gaps in the skills and many who are behind because of illness, adult responsibilities, and high mobility. We have to design for meeting students where they are, and that is what today's webinar is about. So I'm now going to introduce our panelists. Nick's going to speak next, and then Laura and myself are going to go back and forth as we talk about what we found as we did investigations, interviews, and site visits in the field. So let me now introduce Nicholas Donahue, who is talking over the phone without actually being able to see the slides on the webinar and the chat. So thank you, Nick, for tolerating technical difficulties, and here we go. So Nick, your slides are up.
Thank you, and I do have access to the PowerPoint deck. Welcome, everyone. I first want to thank Chris for your leadership, Susan for your generous intro. Really appreciate it. We're glad to be supporting these efforts. And so what I'm going to try to do in the next very few minutes, probably 10 minutes or so, is to frame a couple of key issues related to equity and competency. These are not things that I'm expert about. They're things that the Foundation is concerned about as a leading contributor to competency education and an organization that is deeply concerned with closing gaps and really promoting equitable opportunities and achievement in education. So I'll walk through the bulleted pieces and talk about each one a little bit. So the first, immediate expansion of the gap, a problem we need. So we have an assumption that in a truly competency-driven system, that one early phenomena will be, and there's some evidence of this, that when we remove the artificial floors and ceilings in a traditionally bound system that are driven by age-based grouping, traditional testing, and really an experience or seat time-based way of determining whether learners are on level, quote unquote, or not, we assume that the gap will expand. So if you can imagine a ceiling being placed on a group of 10th graders based on the kind of material they shoot for, the nature of the standardized tests they might be involved with, that in a truly competency-driven system where you are seeking varied evidence of mastery, that you would get a truer and elevated image of learning, not necessarily universally. Some high-end learners put in a position of really needing to demonstrate, their performance may actually drop. But there will be learners for whom, given the opportunity to demonstrate learning in interesting, competency-driven ways, against clear benchmark thresholds of achievement, that we will see an escalation in their performance that will stretch the curve, if you will, to the right-hand side, where given more and more opportunities to demonstrate competency, it will take longer to seek the limits of their knowledge and skills in applied, interesting ways. Likewise, on the lower end, we know that phenomena around low expectations or common grade deflation and others, when we remove the floor, if you will, and get a really truer perspective of some of the capacities and stages of learning of some of our most challenged learners, that we may come to find that some of them are not just 1 or 2 grade levels behind in a particular skill set as determined by a more traditional set of assessments, but given clear and distinct learning thresholds, it may be that in some cases they're certainly higher than we think, but in some cases they may be lower. So there's an assumption that the spread of performance may extend itself. And so the equity implication around this is just that as we have a truer determination of skill and knowledge and performance, that it is essential to maintain a competency-driven approach to learning. It is easy to think that given extended remedial needs on the part of some more challenged learners, that we would slip ourselves back into a more traditional engagement of trying to make up those skills and knowledge. And that we think would be a mistake, that if there's a treatment that is indicated for a learner, that it should persist not only in the mainstream efforts around their learning and their assessment, but also in their remedial experiences. And the same goes for learners on the higher end, that we really continue to think creatively and flexibly about how to meet their needs and not slip back to traditional approaches. The other reason I raise this early is that I think, especially in the context of the Common Core and the emergence of that as set of standards, that we can expect some very dramatic distances between higher and lower learners, and that we resist as well our attention to the middle, which is a common phenomena in education. So the equity implications of this phenomena are the ones I've put on the table. And as I said, these are meant to provoke some engagement and discussion and deliberation. Some of them we feel sure about than others. The next bullet says varied pacing, not a form of tracking. I mean, this is a somewhat of a revisit of the first one, but it's the idea that, and it's rooted and connected to the notion, the equity implication, that of course different supports are needed for different kinds of learners. But it's easy to imagine in a rigorous, really clear, well-developed competency system that our most challenged learners, and I'll pick a category, our young men of color in our schools all across the nation, but in some of our most desperate urban settings, could make up a wide portion of learners who are taking longer. So it's great to say that people all need to work at their own pace. I think that's a very noble and desirable educational principle. And it's not okay for us to not predict that the learners for whom it's going to take longer are going to be the learners who have been least served by our traditional approaches. So, the reasons for this are obvious. It's not okay for a young men of color, for example, to take 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 years to move out of a secondary school engagement in the name of self-pacing and miss years of valuable early employment opportunities. So, easy to predict disaster on this front, but it's a phenomenon that we are seeing emerging, and the solution for it, the equity implication, is obviously inordinate energy and support to address particular situations, but it's a little more complex than that. The other equity implication is that we actually think very differently about solutions for different problems. So in the case of accelerated learners who are moving forward more quickly, the solutions may be to remove traditional boundaries, things that keep them from moving forward. That can be seat time, traditional credit attainment, traditional notions around age. But on the lower end of learning, the implications may be different. It may be that they need additional support, focused assistance, inordinate amounts of support that differ from higher performing learners, and that we really think creatively about how to predict the gaps that could recreate themselves in a competency-based system and think ahead of time about how to limit that phenomena. The third bullet is references something that we've actually seen in action, which is that In education, we think that there's a legitimate concern that traditional assessment methods don't tell the whole story, and that especially for lower performing populations who are seen as really dropping through a floor, that at times we as educators, and I include myself in this, can, in the name of being generous and in the name of giving people the benefit of the doubt, can sometimes promote a grade inflation of sorts that really does not give a true picture of performance at the lower ends. In some ways, we try to make up for what we think are other limitations in the system by not necessarily always providing true estimations and judgments about learning. I was told a story the other week about a school system that is moving in competency direction in the middle grades, and they actually started to remove the higher end of the rubrics around performance because they found the teachers, especially with lower performing students, were moving students very quickly up into those categories of higher performance, even though they had done some hard work to establish the criteria related to excellent performance. They saw a drift north, if you will, to higher estimations of learning that were not grounded because of a sense of misplaced sympathy for the learners who were struggling. And that's a phenomenon that's understandable. It's rooted in generosity. But it needs to be thwarted, as I say here, by a commitment to validity and reliability, to the correct science of assessment that tells us that we can actually be clear and specific about what we expect, and that we can build up our practices so that we are reliably consistent in naming those pieces, and still apply our generosity to lower performing learners in different ways. The second to last bullet is, again, I've talked about this, equitable does not mean equal. Sometimes we mistake equal treatment for equitable treatment, and we mistake equity for sameness, and it's not. Equitable, in our definition, is about being fair, and fairness is about taking into account the differences that learners experience and their different needs. It's the drive behind personalized learning, behind student-centered learning, the notion that we need to think creatively and flexibly about each learner and not mistake the equal application of a mediocre experience as a fair one. So if you extend this to the issue of competency-driven approaches, it means that we need to be careful not to assume that all learners have transportation to interesting real-world opportunities, but accommodate the movement necessary for learners, the access to interesting learning opportunities that may or may not be on a school campus. It means that if learners are a couple of years behind in reading, that we really think creatively about applying intense, very dramatic, personalized mentoring opportunities to bring learners up to learning, or other creative interventions, virtual or personal. And it's just a change of mind for us that simply if everybody gets the same thing, it means that they're getting equitable opportunities, because we think in a diverse world that those notions need to be turned around a bit. The last bullet that I'll talk about a little bit is cost effectiveness through reinvestment. It's really a partner to the family of bullets above. People in this country are very excited about competency-driven approaches to education for various reasons. One of them is that people think that this will be a solution to the 12th year problem, that students who can move forward more quickly will be able to do so. Certainly students at the lower end will get more customized, personalized approaches, be more clear about what they're learning and not. And there are many who see it as a way of really accelerating the departure of learners from the K-12 system, to reduce daily membership counts, to reduce school budgets. This is not a majority of people. Most people don't think that much about this process at all. But it's clear that there are some who've seen this as a way of reducing costs, to move people more quickly and more efficiently through the system. And we think that in the name of equity, that it's important in policy discussions, practice discussions, and public will conversations that we understand that the cost effectiveness through reinvestment is really the solution that successful competency-driven approaches provides. That if there are any cost savings to be made through accelerated moves, through greater efficiency, that it is essential that we stand up for reinvestment of these resources where they're needed most, to provide the equitable, unequal opportunities that I mentioned a few minutes ago. This, of course, leads to a very political and very socially charged arena of needing to rationalize deeper investments in communities that have less. Some of the public information work we've done suggests that people are actually willing to invest differently for different populations and different communities. Our long history of special education suggests that. There are inordinate costs related to special needs students, and there is good public research data that says that people are really interested in equalizing opportunities between communities, and that's why we have some of the tax structures we have where monies are redistributed to areas of greatest need. So we think there's leverage for this idea, but if it doesn't come, if anybody on the call is interested in moving competency approaches forward, you should expect cost efficiencies, and I think the rest of us should expect that you consider the reinvestment of any savings at the places where there's most need. So I'm going to stop right there. I know folks on the call have deep commitments to equity, a lot of people in education. It's why they're in the business, make things better for all of us. And those are some of the issues that have come up as we've driven forward, trying to champion these approaches and really make sure they work for all of us and each one of us. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll certainly take any questions. I'm really interested in what other people think about this topic. I've probably exhausted my knowledge and assumption base in my short presentation. So I'll wait there. And Chris, if there's something that comes on a text or a chat response, just let me know, and I'll answer as best I can.
Great. Thank you, Nick, so much. I have to say I'm going to have that. Actually, we're going to transcribe what you just said, because I think you've organized your thoughts and shared the issues around equity in one of the most both succinct and powerful ways, because there are lots of different elements to it. I did not see any questions, and Susan or Rob, if you see any, please let us. Oh, here's one. So Nick, what are the optimal entry points into competency-based education for urban districts, given the political landscape that shapes them?
Right. So this is something we're very interested in. We're about to announce a number of grants to small urban communities in the Northeast that are grappling with this issue, because it's not a natural place to reshape the entire system, and ones that are struggling, it takes a lot of infrastructure changes. I think most obviously that while we want to be careful about banking on alternative approaches to education, that innovations thrive in spaces that are non-competitive. So in Boston, for instance, there's a school called Boston Day and Evening Academy. It's an alternative school. It's oversubscribed every year because traditional high school principals are sending their kids to these schools who they can't work with. They don't know how to work with. And so alternative education is certainly a place that people can start. The risk, of course, is that effective alternative education programs become an excuse for the failings of the mainstream system. So that's one. We're involved with an effort led by the Schott Foundation to call for a moratorium on out-of-school placements, out-of-school suspensions for learners. Ironically, the #1 cause for out-of-school suspensions in this country is chronic absenteeism, which is kind of interesting that we suspend children for missing school. But one of the conditions that we're trying to wrap around that moratorium is an understanding that an alternative to out-of-school suspension can be personalized education plans that are competency-driven. So it's an odd answer, but that's another answer to me, is standing up against really what ends up being an unintentionally but in action sort of racially charged event with forcing more young people out of school, most significantly young men of color out of school, and seeking an alternative, which is more comprehensive individual assistance for those who are able to engage with it. The third place, I think, where competency could take root in a traditional U.S. urban setting is through the window of differentiated accountability responses. So every school in this country is subject to different kinds of consequences and responses for underperformance. And we'd love to see an opportunity for schools to step forward and say that they have an alternative to traditional consequence moves on the part of the federal government and state accountability frameworks, and volunteer for competency-driven, more personalized approaches for subgroups of learners whose parents and guardians are willing to sign off on these approaches, but we think that accountability really holds some rich avenues. The last one I'd say is really a precursor to competency-driven approaches, which is to advance and explore the extension of performance-based assessments that gather rich and complex data. It's not an essential link to competency approaches in theory. It is an essential link to competency approaches if you if you look at sort of quality lens around the kind of skills and knowledge we want people to take. But we've been pleased with the way that some districts have taken up performance assessment, which can quickly and logically lead to more competency-driven approaches for the complex skills that we are holding up for our young people. Well, that's my answer. I'm, again, really interested if anybody else has
Nick, thank you so much. We're going to have to jump into the rest of the webinar. There were a number of other questions, and so if you can see the chat room, perhaps you can try to answer them. You can scroll back up and see some of those. Otherwise, we'll follow up with you afterwards. So thank you.
I will. Great, Chris. I'm going to say this Chris, I'm going to say one more thing in closing. I will say that competency is an equity solution. And I just ask people to think about that it by design is perfectly oriented to be an answer for closing gaps and lifting learning, if done along the lines of the principles that you've established.
Thank you. So let me introduce you all now to Laura Shabilla, who is going to get us going around the topic of how do we provide adequate supports to our young people.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Chris. I'm really happy to be with you all today. Chris and I really enjoyed being able to work on this paper because we got to talk to so many people all over the country who are doing amazing work. And one of the things that became clear to me in the process of writing this paper was that, very often when we talk about support, we talk about services. And often when we talk about services from a deficit perspective. So kids very often have to fail in order to get access to services. And what I wanted to highlight in terms of what we heard from around the country were that two essential ingredients of support may not be things that immediately come to mind when you think about support, but they really are grounded in this notion of mindset and relationships, but in particular, relationships that are grounded in a lot of assessment and in transparency. So when we talk about mindset, we talk about how we think about learning. And transparency is how we help students understand and own what and why they are learning. A growth mindset, Carol Dweck's work talks a lot about the fixed versus the growth mindset. And a growth mindset assumes that students and adults are always learning and that with the appropriate supports and conditions, they can be motivated to do their best. It says that intelligence is not a fixed thing, but that growth and learning occur all the time. And in a lot of the research that's out there about student motivation and engagement, there's a lot of talk about how students are very motivated when they understand that their own skills are something that they can continue to develop regardless of their past performance and their past experiences. When students receive support in a competency-based system, they are always tracking their learning. And this becomes a very important part of how to support them in this particular kind of an environment. In schools where there's a fixed mindset and not a growth mindset, a lot of what happens in learning becomes very stagnant. And assessments are something that happens to students, for example, and they're given feedback on that. And it isn't seen as much as a developmental process where learning is always going to be the process of stretching yourself to the next thing that you need to understand. We Nick talked some about pacing, and there's a big transparency. Pacing is very important also in transparency around pacing to make sure that while we want to personalize learning and make sure students are able to go at their own pace, we want this to be a success-enabling pace and for students to understand that the expectations around being able to complete and move forward with competencies. We don't want kids to get stuck and have a new achievement gap that happens because we're letting kids self-pace and not really thinking about what that means in terms of their ability to be successful in the long term. The next slide really talks about some of what we're talking about when we talk about the learning edge. So when we're talking about the learning edge, we're talking about creating opportunities where students feel stretched and that what students are learning should feel just beyond their reach but possible with support. It's the difference between what students can do independently and what they can do with an adult's help. And when we're thinking about the learning edge, part of what we need to be aware of is how we are taking into account students' experiences as they engage this information. There's some really good and interesting research that's coming out of neuroscience that talks about the students' first experience and engagement with a complex task should be positive, and that what we hold with us when we are engaged in a complex task where we have an experience of possibility is that we're willing to work harder, take more risks, and stretch ourselves in order to make that possibility of really building skills a reality. We also want to make sure that while we challenge students and we help them see within the rubrics and things that they are becoming acquainted with in the process of competency learning, that we're providing the support so that they can achieve that next level of skill. We want to set students up for success and not failure. And a lot of times we think of stretching students. We don't always think about what is it going to take to scaffold that experience so that they can actually see success every step of the way, even as they make their way from one level of competency to the next level of competency. When we talk about in the work that we did, we through the work with practitioners really came up with a number of 6 design principles. And the first one of those design principles really focuses on building a culture, a growth mindset culture, and creating the kinds of protocols and practices. So this is on the next slide, Chris. Creating a set of protocols and practices that really embody this philosophy. So as I said before, in schools that don't have a growth mindset, these types of protocols can be oppressive. They can be really based on controlling students' behavior rather than expanding and helping for students to gain access to the next level of their learning. So when we think about the protocols and practices that we want to have in place in schools, many of the schools and places like the main cohort for customized learning have implemented a number of different practices by making standards and rubrics transparent to students, not just in the what they are learning, but why they are learning it and what the implications are if they learn at a certain level versus the implications of what they can achieve and be what's available to them if they push that learning and learn at the next level. And what people have found is the more transparent they are with students about the impact of the decisions they're making around their level of engagement and learning for the rest of their lives, the more students begin to take on a different level of challenge. Schools that infuse this mindset also make the practice of help seeking a sign of growth and not failure. So very often, if you think about it, when kids ask for help, it's often seen as a sign that they don't know something or that it's something that kids are often embarrassed about, whether it's asking for help from peers or from the adults in the setting. And so for both adults and young people to be able to model help seeking and to be able to say, when we are seeking help, it means we're growing and we're learning, and that's a really positive thing and an important thing to reframe. And also important to recognize is the distinction between pushing and supporting students and setting a student up for failure. So when we talk about the edge versus the ledge, we want to make sure that young people are operating right at the edge. They feel stretched, but they feel excited, and they feel empowered to take that next step to really learn what they're seeking to learn, but not so far outside of their comfort zone without the support they need, where they feel like it's just an opportunity to fail. And especially for some of our young people who have had multiple experiences of failure, the growth is, building this kind of a culture really helps them learn to take risks in a way that they can see success every step of the way. So Chris is going to take us through the next design principle, which is about utilizing assessments.
Thank you, Laura. Oh my gosh. So, utilizing assessments that are transparent, as Laura just talked about, ongoing, and providing meaningful feedback to support student learning and agency. So, the more I learn about this one, the more I think that this is one of the fundamental changes around competency education from the time-based A through F grading system. So, the minute we start to think about assessments as providing feedback to students, we are actually starting to reshape the entire culture around learning and shifting away from A through F about how am I doing compared to the other students in the classroom to looking at feedback as something that's positive and constructive to the student learning. So for folks who are really new and getting started around this work, I think one of the most important questions to ask yourself is, what is the purpose of your homework, quizzes, and tests? I had not seen or come across the concern that competency education is just about testing until recently during some site visits where the issue came up. And when it came down to it, the schools had not fully made the shift to seeing assessment as part of the learning process, but it was still being perceived as something that students had to do that they could get grades for or points for that contributed to their grade. And so the emphasis is, what grade do I have instead of what have I learned and how am I doing in my learning? And that difference is profound in between a competency-based school and one that isn't. The other issue to think about is utilizing assessments in a constructive, meaningful way is to what degree and what aspects of being student-centered is going to be emphasized in your school. But a huge difference is between those schools that are personalized and student-centered and those that are implementing proficiency-based or competency-based in a way that does not have that value. And so those are two things to really think about as you're going forward, as well as certainly these design questions. A few examples. In Maine, we see options of students who could learn, practice, and demonstrate their learning being supported by blended learning, where they were able to access curriculum and performance tasks and opportunities to practice. Homework was an opportunity to show and demonstrate their learning. It was not something they had to do. And then the other, going back to the grading systems, there's lots of schools that who have moved towards standards-based grading and are using 80-20 or 90-10 in the sense that 90% is actually based on that they are demonstrating learning on the competencies, but they still hold some points for extra credit in homework. But there are other schools I've seen in Maine and in California that are using the grading system of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and what they really relate to are the depths of knowledge. So 4 is really the deeper learning. 1 is being familiar with something. And so it's no longer a grading system, but really a way of tracking and monitoring how students are doing. For any school moving to competency-based learning, one of the things you do want to think about is what your reassessment policies are. It's very important to give some time for those students who did not learn the first time through to have opportunities to reassess and reassess in different ways. But at the same time, you're going to have a group of students who are going to be trying to always get the highest grade if you maintain any element of that grading system in place. And that can really begin to wear on teachers who are trying to meet the needs of students in multiple ways. And I'm hoping practitioners are all, I'm not reading the chat room, but you all are throwing your thoughts in about all of this as we go along too. So principle 3 is develop the embedded, tiered, and timely interventions for just-in-time support that leads to successfully meeting or exceeding the learning targets. Bottom line, we don't wait till the end of the semester to see that a student failed. That should actually not happen. It doesn't mean that some students won't need more time, especially if they have a lot of gaps and started farther behind than other students. They may need more time to complete or fully demonstrate the learning. But what we should never have students just failing at the end of a semester in a competency-based system. A couple of the techniques that we're seeing around the country, certainly grouping and regrouping, we see it often. And going back to the equity question, yes, it can look like tracking if it's not competency-based, if supports are not in place, and if the students are not being grouped and regrouped frequently. There needs to be time for students, opportunities for students to be able to access higher and more advanced learning at any point. But we do see it. We also see effective grouping and regrouping is being done with when principals are deploying their best teachers to the students who are the furthest behind, or grouping and regrouping in ways that resources are being directed to the kids who need the most help. Certainly, the embedded during the day, it's not just study hall, but all the competency-based schools that I have visited that are really doing high-quality work with a focus on equity do have some type of hour, hour and a half during the day that students can work on whatever it is they want to work on and whatever they're struggling with. Even if you're a student in physics, you may need some, or advanced placement physics, you may need some extra help during the day, but it's obviously critically important for any student who's really struggling. Schools are handling that differently, again, about how student-centered they are. In some, the teachers actually give little passes to students saying, I want to see you during the study hall time. They call it different things. But others, the students are actually able to go wherever they want to whatever teacher that they think can best help them. So there's variations in schools. The big design challenge we have is trying to design to make sure that there's enough supports for students who are significantly behind, more than 2 years behind. We talk about scaffolding, but a lot of folks also tell me that more than 2 years behind, scaffolding really stretches beyond most teachers' abilities. And And so that we may be looking at a combination of scaffolding and grouping. But that is obviously a design challenge for all of us. And then summertime and the use of time. I just got back from Oregon, and I heard 2 different principals talking about how that they are starting to think about using their FTE time instead of 50% in the fall and 50% in the spring. They're now thinking about why not save some of that FTE time for the summer for those students who need that extra support or to help students complete specific competencies. Okay, Laura, I'm passing it back to you.
Great, thanks. So the next principle involves developing extended opportunities to learn. And when we talk about extended opportunities to learn, we're not just talking about more time for tutoring or to build academic skills through remediation or double blocks or things like that. We're talking about really extending opportunities to learn beyond school time, perhaps even with partners that are beyond the school itself, and using things like internships, online learning, project-based learning, college and career connections to move beyond the traditional school day and to help students understand how they can master competencies within those environments. One of the things that people have, there are people in groups in Denver and in New Hampshire who are really doing some exciting work with extended learning opportunities. And one of the things they've come across is that as you start to work with a network of providers, for example, it provides a real opportunity to organize partner work and to help partners think about what the value add is that they can contribute to student learning by making the competencies transparent not just to the students but to the partners as well. Grace Cannon, who's on this call from the School District of Philadelphia, who's doing the Proficiency-Based Pathways work, has done a project around a film badging project. Badging presents some really interesting opportunities to think about in extended learning opportunities, and the badging project that they're doing is aligned with the Common Core state standards and dovetails with some of their core content. Another issue that comes up and is tackled some in the technology paper that CompetencyWorks and INACOL put out is about what the learning management system needs to look like. And when you're thinking about extended learning opportunities, the kind of platform that you have that allows students to contribute artifacts of their work, that allows community partners who are working with students to also be involved with teachers in looking at student work, is another way to really extend the transparency around the competencies and the work that students are doing beyond the walls of the school. When one of the first steps is really thinking about what is the network of opportunities that are available for students in extended learning, and going back to the conversation about equity, how do we make sure that extended learning opportunities are also being driven so that we make sure that kids who have more resources and means, who might be able to access different kinds of learning opportunities and receive credit for those and be able to accelerate their learning, don't get so far ahead of students perhaps who don't have those resources and means just because they have additional resources. And so thinking about what is the structure and the institutional system to support extended learning opportunities, not just what do students have access to and how can we make sure they get credit for that work, which also is a part of creating an extended learning system, but not the whole answer. The students really being able to select and then reflect on what they're learning in these experiences. When I was out in Denver, it was really interesting because students were coming back to the school and saying, I'm involved in this particular activity and this is what I'm learning and this is what I believe that I should be able to, how I can show mastery with this particular learning target or set of competencies. And so it really provides an opportunity for students to reflect on what they're learning outside of the classroom as well. The next design principle involves really knowing and understanding the whole student and seeking to understand both their life and their learning. And when we talk to practitioners around the country, one of the things that we saw was that in competency-based systems that are really focused on the whole student, social emotional learning and lifelong learning competencies, some people talk about them as 21st skills competencies, are included in the competency system. In some cases, they're integrated and embedded in the competency system. In some cases, they're measured independently from the academic content. but there is an attention to those competencies and a value placed on those kinds of habits of learning that is an important part of the overall competency system that the students are part of, and that teachers are also really engaged in their own process of learning and mastering that particular set of competencies as well. How staff are organized to support students both structurally but also from a resource allocation and a staffing perspective looks different across schools. So, you know, there's the advisory model where there is a person involved in the school who's responsible for a certain subset of students, and knowing that student really well is one model that we've seen a lot of. One of the cautions that we heard was that while schools want to be sure that they understand where the responsibility lies for this task of kind of really knowing and understanding the whole student, it also doesn't necessarily work best when it's a completely separated task from teaching and learning. And so where there have been kind of clear advisory structures, one of the challenges we've heard in those schools is that the advisors are then seen by the parent and the student as the person who's responsible for knowing and understanding the student, and then they become an advocate, and the teachers may or may not always have access to that same level of information. So it's really important culturally and from a student support perspective to think about how that information is shared and permeated in a respectful way inside the school, and what information really needs to be housed at the classroom level and at the school level and the system level, and what are the responsibilities for each of those systems from a data perspective, but also from a reflection and awareness perspective, and really understanding the strengths and challenges that students are bringing with them every day as they enter the learning environment. And so Chris, I'll turn it over to you to talk about the last principle.
Here we are, Principle 6, implementing a continuous improvement system that responds to keep students within or above pacing expectations. It's fascinating to me as you visit schools, you often hear the conversation around continuous improvement, and it's really because competency education, the growth mindset, the focus on learning creates a learning culture, and that's in fact what a continuous improvement system is. It obviously will relate very much to what the information system is that's been set up. That provides a lot of data, but a continuous improvement system actually starts with the types of questions and the ways that you think about measuring what's important in your organization. So one of the early emerging issues that we're finding across the country, and there's no paper on this yet, I don't even think there's agreement, but what are the metrics that would drive a continuous improvement system in a competency-based system? Obviously, pacing matters. When I was at Barack Obama Charter School in South LA, they actually are monitoring student pacing to the degree that they can see how their students are on pace, and this is an elementary school, how they are proceeding in terms of their benchmark is to get kids to at least proceeding at 1 grade level per year, based on Common Core or some other set of competencies and standards, or they actually drive to 1.5 rate of learning because so many of their students are actually behind even as they enter elementary school. They are actually able then to see how the students are doing once they've been validated around their proficiency, so that they've got a number of different ways that are driving their improvement efforts. And the teachers are engaged in that process. Another issue is around cost effectiveness. How are we using resources, and are they really getting us where we want to go? I mentioned before principals who are starting to think about using their FTE differently. Certainly generation schools, although not competency-based at this point, can really inform how you can reorganize and deploy your resources during the day, over the school year, and over the whole year, to make sure that students have more time and more flexibility to get what they need. And then there's another process around thinking about the engagement levels of students beyond what they have to do for school, but that are driving more towards their own development, their own engagement, their own love of learning. If you've looked at the Buzz, the video about Buzz, it's an interesting model where they're actually able to monitor students' engagement as well as their pacing, and so teachers have a two-way looking at how students are doing each day and being able to respond to that. We also see that in those schools and districts that have a information system that's been very well developed, there's the process of continuous improvement, the process of making sure that students are on pace is actually shared by parents, students, and educators. And we'll see that with the Educate information system at Lindsay, that parents and students have access to that and know not only what they're working on, how they're proceeding, but what's coming up next. And that the continuous improvement systems, when you have a well-developed information system, can provide incredibly powerful feedback for teachers individually, in groups, and in departments to build up their own capacity. And so that will all have a lot of impact as we go forward into seeing how schools develop and how the models develop if they're actually responding to a continuous improvement system. Again, the big challenge is we don't actually know how to measure all of these things yet, and we also don't know how to measure when students have what I call concentrated learning needs, when they have more than 2 years behind or significant gaps, and students are actually proceeding at multiple levels of learning at the same time. So I'm going to wrap that up for Principle 6, and we're going to take some questions, and I'm going to turn to Rob or Susan to see if you want to throw out any questions that have been raised.
There were a lot of conversations happening in the chat room, but we'll open it up for specific questions for Chris and Laura now. Thanks. One of the questions that came up during Nick's talk was, where are you seeing large comprehensive high schools that have successfully tackled the pacing issue with all structural pieces that come into play? And I didn't know if you had comments on that. I was thinking about Michigan's Education Achievement Authority, the Diploma Plus model, and it's not necessarily a large comprehensive high school, well, either of those, and Lindsay in California. I didn't know if you or Chris, if you or Laura wanted to comment on that.
Sure, this is Chris. I'll dive in first, and then Laura, if you want to add anything. I think the best example that I have seen of the most well-developed is in Lindsay. And that's a state that does not have a competency-based policy. There's no major initiatives going this way, but Lindsay has developed over the past 4 years and started with their high school, I believe. And what I want to say is they don't have all the answers, but what they have is a transparency and an honesty when we talk about continuous improvement to look at the challenges and try to figure out new ways of handling things. So there are daily supports for kids, and they're able to find the teachers that they need that will help them the most. There's scaffolding going on in a number of the different classrooms. Teachers are working together in departments to try to figure out how to help all of their kids. They're very asset-based. So I was talking to a young person in the CTE. He really loves industrial arts, but he already had, by 10th grade, 2 advanced placement courses in Spanish AP and English AP. He said the English was easy for him because he had learned all the words in Spanish and was able to translate them back. So you can see a lot of different resources and being deployed different ways there. Certainly in Maine, there's a number of districts that have been proceeding. If folks want to hear the last webinar, we heard from Gray, New Gloucester, and that's highlighted in Making Mastery Work. But that's another district. They rolled up from elementary to high school. So, and then certainly in New Hampshire, it's rolling back from high schools altogether, and they are large high schools. Let me stop there, Laura.
No, I think those are the ones that you mentioned and that Susan mentioned were the ones that I was thinking about.
Okay, so I don't see any other burning questions. Oh, there's response to intervention strategies fitting into the supports.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Laura.
Well, I would just say I think response to intervention was something that I definitely see fitting into this kind of a framework if it's used in the way that response to intervention was intended. And so response to intervention, I think what a lot of schools miss who are trying to implement response to intervention is really the first principle, which is that we want to try to design a system that is going to work for as many students as possible. And so response to intervention works as long as it doesn't become a numbers game where we're just looking at what percentage of students are in what tiers and moving kids kind of into those tiers. But starting from an approach that's highly universal, personalized, competency-based in some ways should be able to get us to the first tier of that particular approach.
Great, thanks, Laura. So let's just quickly, we've got just a few more minutes. So Laura has a few comments about educators on the learning edge, and Laura, why don't you do that and leave me 1 minute to wrap up.
Yeah, so to spend 1 minute on the role of educators is we don't want you to think that's how important we think that it is, because in some ways this should almost be what we lead with, because the role of educators in understanding how to support students in a competency-based environment is really important and different. The roles that the adults in the system play are different, the power dynamic is different, and more, I think, we need to be thinking about how are we actually asking the adults in the system to do the same kinds of things we're asking young people to do. So what is the set of competencies? How are the adults in the system managing and tracking their own progress against that set of competencies? As we move into blended learning environments, what kind of professional development that are teachers taking their own courses online? Really thinking about the roles of teachers. And so right now there are a lot of roles that we're asking an individual teacher to play. But when you look at the bullets and think about the kinds of things that teachers are going to be able to know and be able to do to support students, a fundamentally different staffing structure is likely to be necessary. And this is something we heard across the country. Is one of the things this is really pushing is for people to rethink what the facilitators of learning need to know and be able to do, and how much of that needs to be housed in one person and how much of that needs to be spread across multiple people, and then what that means about teams and redundancy and support of students. So I think the two most important things that we heard across the country around educators is just having an understanding of what the competency system is for educators and putting them into a similar experience as learners in the building, and then really thinking about the roles and function of educators and how that may need to shift in a competency-based environment. I'll turn it back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, everybody. I want to thank all the practitioners, incredible educators that we had in today's webinar in the chat room. It was just like a little TA fest going on. I have to go back and look at all of it over again because it was really exciting to me. I just want to thank you all. And I want to thank Laura. I want to thank Nick, who jumped on to help us do the introductory statements. We're going to try to write this all up, transcribe it all, because I think so much of this was so important. Coming up in May, we have a webinar on state policy and the role that the state policy makers are playing in advancing competency education, and it will be fascinating. We have Jason Glass from Iowa and Don Savitsky from Maine, and Susan Patrick will be leading that webinar. It's May 17th from 3 to 4 Eastern Time. And then we'll also be working on a paper on grading, and we're going to have to reframe this because it's not going to actually say it's on grading, but it's about the transformation, about having assessment be meaningful to kids, and how schools can make sense of that as they walk away from the A through F grading system to one that is much more meaningful to kids. And anybody who wants to contribute, please just let me know. You can actually just put something in the chat room if you want to be interviewed or have something to offer in that discussion. It would be incredibly helpful. And so that is all. We will see you on the next webinar. Thanks. Bye, everybody.